Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the session, Hearing the Unheard, Why Equity-Focused Research Matters in Product Design. My name is Morgan Ramsey, and I am deeply, deeply honored to be given this opportunity to speak with you all today about my work, my journey, what my team's working on, and hopefully leave you all with some takeaways so you might be able to implement some of our learnings into your product design cycle. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. As I said, I'm Morgan Ramsey. I'm a UX researcher at Google on the equity engineering team. And so today I'll talk a little bit more, as I said, about my team and what we do. And the takeaways will be at the very end. But if you are interested in emailing me or have to drop off at any point, my email is Morgan or M Ramsey, M as in Mary, RAMSEY, at google.com. And that link will be at the very end. Okay, let's go ahead and without further ado, let's get started. So when I usually talk about my background, I typically start with this slide. And so I'm curious if anyone knows what this slide is without kind of reading on the bottom left corner. Well, it's a cotton field, and it's right outside of my great-grandmother's house in East Aboga, Alabama. So for those who may not know what a cotton field is a bed of land where American slaves would have to pick the crop, which was cotton, for their white slave masters. My family were slaves, and so they did work on this actually very field that's across from my great-grandmother's home over 100 years ago. And so growing up alongside with that history, with my grandmother walking alongside Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, her grandparents working on the fields, and even now to Black Lives Matter, my parents and my family has always emphasized the importance of advocacy, whether that's for yourself or for other people. We always emphasize the point of advocating for what's right and just, regardless of how society might see you or categorize your value. On the other side, my dad's family is from Denver, Colorado. And so also my family on that side were former slaves, but they just migrated west. And in the West, there was a combination of Mexican-American, African-American, and Indigenous American, this beautiful blend of cultures where people worked alongside each other and supported each other in their business and their ventures. And so on the left-hand side is actually a photo of my family's restaurant, the Tamale Inn. And it's very interesting because my family is African-American, but they owned a tamale shop, which is traditionally a Mexican dish. And so on the right side is my grandmother alongside her two uncles. And so this whole vibrant culture of what was going on in Denver really emphasized the values of having empathy and extending grace and understanding another person who might be different than you. And even deeper than that, what it really means to feel like you belong in spaces where you may not fit in. So growing up, I was always curious about life and had these two values of advocacy and empathy at the core of my value system. And so with that, I started questioning a lot around the status quo. Why were some groups marginalized where other ones weren't? Why did some people have opportunities where other groups didn't? And so my curiosity really encouraged me to go to a school where I could focus on advocacy work. And so I decided to go to Duke in 2012 until graduating in 2016. Where I was a public policy major. And my goal there was to go into law or research and advocate for underrepresented groups. And so as I was doing research within Duke, I still felt like it was important, but I still wanted to know more. I still wanted to hear from the voices of the people we were researching and learning about and trying to advocate for. But I really wanted to get on the ground and understand why my expectation of human-centered values and the reality of our American culture just didn't seem like they were aligning. So with that, I decided to dedicate the majority of my collegiate career to researching in the Dominican Republic. And so I did the research in 2013, but in 2008, the Dominican Republic revoked birthright citizenship to Haitian Dominicans. And that meant that it wasn't necessarily just Dominicans that were immigrated from Haiti or their parents were from Haiti, but even went back to if one of your grandparents was from Haiti, then that would affect your great children or your grandchildren, which in turn affected thousands of people who were in the Dominican Republic. by having some type of descent from Haiti, there are thousands of people in the Dominican Republic who are left without being able to attend school or have job opportunities, etc. So instead of kind of discovering and studying the secondhand on secondhand resources or reading about it in books while I was comfortable in my kind of Duke ivory tower, I really wanted to get my hands dirty and really start to explore and hear from the people who were being affected what they needed in this situation, not just what I thought. My hypothesis was that it was going to be some type of e-learning or technology experience that could bring these opportunities and kind of circumvent this policy. But I still wanted to explore whether that was true, or if not, what other solutions should we consider and tech should consider while building for underrepresented groups. And that's exactly what I did. I went to the Dominican Republic and I interviewed 60 plus women in 3 remote locations, whether that be the beach communities, mountain communities, or inland country communities, to learn about their experiences and how their lives may have been affected due to this discriminatory policy. So every day, that picture on the right-hand side at the bottom is the truck that I rode in. And I would pop out with my little pens and paper, and I spoke only Spanish and Creole. And so for over a month within country and over 6 months working on the entire study, I felt that there needed to be some type of technology element to this. That was corroborated through talking with the women and children there about what they needed. And I felt like technology could somehow create some type of, or bring back the opportunities that were taken away from this community. In 2013, that's also when Google Noon was kicking off and being a larger conversation about bringing internet to remote locations. And so I thought, this must be a lead. Google might have the answer. Let me go there and figure out if I could figure out how we can bring opportunities to this now disenfranchised community. So I applied to Google as a sophomore in college. I completed 2 internships in the People Operations Organization, which is technically HR. And then in 2016, after I graduated from Duke, I landed a full-time position in the HR department. I'll have full disclosure, though, a large part of my struggle at Google was that I felt that my current role and my career aspirations didn't align, and my mission, even as a person apart from my career. I wanted to be on a research org or on a team dedicated to advocating for underrepresented groups. But I was slotted instead into this kind of HR analyst program. And Google was such a big place. And I knew that the only way I was going to be able to get to where I wanted to be was if I kind of took matters into my own hand and I designed a pathway at Google for myself. So over the course of 3-4 years, I worked very strategically to be on 3 separate teams in HR. One was in GPS Ops, which is Global People Services and Operations. And that's kind of the standardized HR process, how we're filing people in and how we're filing them out. And across 2 different countries, my favorite being Ireland, where I spent a period of time there working to explore opportunities and understand experiences that Googlers internationally were having. And so within this process that I took a lot of risks for scoping my own research and moving across countries and coasts. But eventually I landed on this amazing team that I'm on now called Equity Engineering. And so I would like to kind of just pause here and call out that although I'm on an engineering team and I'm in an engineering department, that doesn't mean we just code. In fact, I don't even know how to code, but it also means that while we're building a product, that means that it requires much more than just this hard coding language that is often thought of when we think of engineering. The truth is the product lifecycle involves a variety of roles from a variety of backgrounds with a variety of skill sets. And so we work with product managers, designers, and researchers and engineers to build the best in-class products for Googlers and external. So all that to say, engineering includes more than just engineers. And so if you're interested in this type of work and you don't have an engineering background, this is definitely something that could apply for you or in your teams as well. So let's go ahead and give into a little deeper dive of what the team is and what we do. So the team called Equity Engineering was founded by Dema Rosa Rodriguez, and it's now led by Dr. Jason Randolph. And the team at its core is dedicated to dismantling systemic discrimination. And so ultimately, our overall goal is to uncover some of these barriers that might be buried within our internal tools and processes, and even external as well, whether they're implicit or explicit, and work with product to design them out. Some would argue that racism is by design. I would also agree with that. Therefore, we're doing our best to design racism or discrimination or whatever it might be out of our systems and processes. Our team makeup is also something that we're very, very proud of. We're from a diverse set of ethnicities across multiple genders, different family structures, professional experiences. And that is because we are very intentional about having a team that reflects what society looks and feels like. Society isn't a monolith, it's not homogenous. And so we believe our teams shouldn't be either. So that's what we're really working on within Equity Engineering, and we have a beautiful set of faces to work towards this goal. And if we're going to break it down a little bit more in a nuance, we have 4 major pillars: transform development, centralize research, build equity fluency, and finally, center equity in design. So for our first pillar, transform development, we work on how to infuse a mindset of diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the entire product development and engineering process and cycle. It's not just in the theoretical. We're not just kind of popping out concepts or tacking this to the end, but we actually apply the expertise that we're learning through every stage of the design process, making sure that we're keeping teams accountable for executing on this application and baking it into their design requirements and engineering priorities. Secondly, we think about centralizing research. So traditionally, UX researchers are kind of seen as the last stop on the train for a product cycle. The engineers build it, and then the researchers test it, and then the designers make it pretty, for lack of better terms. We're the people who test the product and make sure it works. However, our equity engineering team, we do the inverse approach, where we actually start with the research before we design the solution. So we can really have a deeper understanding of the problem space and therefore decide what we should be able to build. On that same note, teams also tend to test products or evaluate products with underrepresented groups at the very, very end of the cycle, if at all. And there's kind of an assumption that it will work regardless. So this is kind of a side project, but we're good to go. However, our team makes sure to conduct user research, construct journeys, and develop product roadmaps to address these use cases that might impact underrepresented groups in the beginning, at the early stages. And because we truly feel that if you bring the worst off up, the rest will benefit as well. Third is building equity fluency. So traditionally, UX kind of goes off into their own little corner and nobody really knows what goes on. And then they pop out some statistics or a deliverable for a product manager. But there's not really kind of fluidity between that process, between product and design and research. So we have a very collaborative approach for our team where we're bringing in stakeholders through all different walks within the product development cycle. Well, we're inviting them into this learning environment space. So that's a huge part of the way we approach research, is that we're providing educational opportunities for different people within this cycle, whether it's product managers, engineers, designers, to learn with us and learn equity concepts with us, whether that's in reading literature with us or having conversations, so that in a way we're teaching them how to fish rather than just kind of giving them the fish. And that way will apply to their later work as well. And finally, having an equity-centered or in design. And that means partnering directly with underrepresented communities and prioritizing, as I said, the most marginalized first, and engaging with collaborators at every stage of the design cycle. A huge point to this is that this is not a reactive transactional relationship that we're building. We really work proactively to build rapport in these communities and build trust within these communities, and not asserting that we have the answers to everything. Instead, we're trying to design with and build with them rather than just for them. And that's kind of my approach that I use in the Dominican Republic. And so that's something I definitely take seriously while doing my research within equity engineering, is bringing everybody to the table. So into the weeds, as I'm talking about what I do, we can get into that a little bit too. So I work on the strategic design for foundational research. What that means is I figure out what we should be researching and why. More importantly, this is, like I said, at the beginning stages. So I'm working with project managers, design leads, other stakeholders, so we can explore the problem space together while I'm reviewing either their proposed research plans or working cross-functionally on their design concepts. I'm the person in there to say, okay, how are we thinking about equity within this? How can we ask our questions in a different way? How can we bring other people to the table to have this concept validation, and overall thinking about a system? Constantly thinking about systems. How will this product impact a system? What is the system we're impacting? And furthermore, and most importantly, who will be most disadvantaged if we release this product? So these are the kind of conversations I'm having on a day-to-day basis with all people across the product design cycle. And even in those conversations, what we start to have, there's a little bit of confusion, or we start to clarify, is, oh, you do product inclusion. And we hear that there's some type of confusion within this. So I will also share that we are not product inclusion. While the terminology also applies in terms of our end goal, and we are both teams striving for the same goal, we have different approaches on how we're embedding and putting in that inclusion to in our tools and processes. Product inclusion is fantastic, needed, and definitely the foreground for how we were able to build this team. But it is at the end of the life cycle, kind of giving a tactical kind of usability list of suggestions on things to do and consider next time. Whereas equity engineering is kind of at the beginning at the stages. It's a lot of foundational exploratory research, building community rapport, having this long tail to this entire process as it's threaded in each part of the design cycle. So while we appreciate product inclusion, our team is more so focused on a different approach on how to embed inclusion into a product. And also, if we think about the impact on the entire life cycle, before equity engineering, the traditional research is expected to kind of meet where that blue circle is before it gets to the larger black circle, where it says iteration, launch, iterate, design, cyclical process that's coming from a brainstorm idea. And that's kind of where you see the usability, the traditional kind of test it out after we've built something. Well, equity engineering actually backs it all the way back up and tries to bring in this design thinking concept back into the cycle. We want to define the challenge, observe the need, form the insights before we brainstorm ideas, and we look to solutions. So that's really where our talking to the community, having all these interview questions really comes into play. So we can start to really think about the challenge before we design the solution. So ultimately, the goal of our team is to humanize technology, not just about who or how we're keeping the user at the forefront, but really keeping the underrepresented user at the forefront in early stages, not at the end, but in the early stages of the product life cycle, so that we can truly design for everyone. So if you are a designer or a project manager or a startup entrepreneur or researcher, one thing we would share to you is to please hear from the community that is most underrepresented to see how your product launch can benefit their needs. Even if it's not an empathy and a hearts and mind portion, and if that's not resonating to do the right thing, you also need to think about how engaging these groups might actually help you with your adoption rate and also as a risk mitigation strategy. It saves you time on the end where you might not have to create a whole different product, or maybe even backtrack some poor publicity if this doesn't work for a certain group. So essentially, our team, as I said, is trying to bring back centralizing equity within product research and design, because if we don't, there can be a lot of negative consequences for everybody involved. One case in which this happened was a very common example in 2018 with the Google Photos incident. So for those who may not be familiar, in 2018, Google Photos went viral on social media because it mislabeled a Black person as a gorilla. And in the US and globally, comparing a Black person to a gorilla has a deep history that's rooted in very racially insensitive language. So in this situation that happened at Google, which can also happen broadly as well, we have to look at our teams and at our training models and ask, why did this happen? Do we have enough representation in our models? Do we have enough representation in our design, on our teams? Another example is within Amazon Music. So this is a post on the right-hand side from Instagram where a popular US artist, Megan Thee Stallion, wrote that she had to speak or had to put on her proper voice while speaking to Alexa. And a proper voice in Black American culture and colloquial terms is really a coded term for a white people sounding voice. And in the video, when she's talking to Alexa, you see her change the way she speaks. She raises her pitch and voice. She over articulates and enunciates every letter and every word so that Alexa will be able to understand her over her thick, natural Southern accent. And so in both examples, not only is this not good for the brand of the companies, because these situations were both having millions of views and retweets, and now it's kind of embedded in the minds of the viewers to say, oh, this product won't work for me. But it's also not good for the product and definitely not good for the people who are using it. Similarly, if there were a company to release a voice-oriented feature that did not account for people that might need closed captions to engage, or if there was a rideshare product that refused rides to a certain neighborhood, these are also situations in popular technology where some users are left out. And they're not thinking about the ripple effect on the system or for marginalized users. Within my own project that I'm working on now, our team is looking at these very ripple effects. So right now, our team is exploring some internal career mobility journeys and how we might be able to introduce a tool to serve those needs. And unfortunately, I can't give too much detail around this research due to confidentiality, but essentially what happened was before my team joined this project, a tool was initially proposed to meet internal career development needs for Googlers. The only problem was that the research and the design process up until this point did not centralize how this could impact equity and underrepresented users. The team didn't really think through who could be a disadvantage of this product and how can we adjust the design to meet their needs. So, in lack of better terms, it probably wasn't going to work for everybody. And as a response, our team wanted to go in there and consult the team on how we might be able to understand who the most vulnerable population would be in this scenario. So we looked at quantitative intersectionality data around attrition rates, which is also public data at diversity-google that you can go ahead and look into our diversity annual report. And we learned that the group that was attriting most from Google were Black women. So I was a lead researcher on this, and we decided to evaluate some of the initial design concepts by interviewing 23 Black women across the company to hear their opinions on this tool. And to the products team's surprise, it came back that the concept could potentially be harmful more than helpful. And so we decided as a group that it was best that we kind of pause the launch in favor of conducting more deeper research around understanding user needs in career journeys, specifically for underrepresented groups. So at the moment, we're doing a lot more research in this space to understand what tool we might be able to launch that will help everybody. But essentially, this was a huge learning experience. I also think this is very fascinating if you look at the news article to the right-hand side of the slide, where we see a woman who writes that she could casually have a conversation with an executive and then network to land a role. However, just as we saw with the tool, the concept of mobility is not simplistic. It's not that simple. There are a lot of complexities and a lot of different systems working in place that makes the career development cycle very complex. And so if there's anything to take away from this is that there are so many systems that are in play that are working one within another. It's not very as simplistic. If you release a tool and it will work for everybody, it's more complicated than that. So we urge product teams to be mindful of all the different systems connecting and seeing how launching a tool isn't as simple as it seems, as it will have deeper impacts on some type of system. So overall, I show this slide because we're designing for the most underrepresented user first and bringing those insights and baking them in early to the product design lifecycle. Example of when this worked really well was with the curb cut effect. So this is an image of a curb cut, which is when you're walking on the street and there's that lower part that feeds into the street. Well, this was designed in the 1940s for accessibility needs for wheelchairs so that they were able to get on the sidewalk. But today it's relevant and useful for everyone. If you have little kids, if you have strollers, if you're walking with heels, everyone benefits from it, even though the initial intent were to meet accessibility needs. And so that's our goal as a team, as an organization. We're trying to build this curb cut theory into our tools and our processes moving forward. So as we're wrapping up, I want to leave you all with a few takeaways to think about and baking into your products or any products or team structure that you would look to build. First and foremost is triangulating data. And so that means as we were collecting our existing product research, we noticed that there were gaps in those research. And typically we kind of leave those gaps, but in this case, we'd never done research that focused on underrepresented groups, such as Black women Googlers. But given the data, we identified that it would be critical to conduct research within this community to understand some of those gaps and do some of that gap analysis. So all that to say, for your products, don't just settle for the data that you have access to or that your team has created, but instead find other sources, poke holes into your arguments, evaluate the gaps in your data and your prior research, and identify where underrepresented groups might be having a different experience. Number two is one of my favorites, which is essentially just have conversations, talk to your community, triangulate this knowledge with different people. We found that this was critical to the entire process, not just to connect with teams across the company, but to connect with communities that were affected in order to understand how we might be able to build a tool that is equitable and progresses their trajectory as well. And so we work to build ongoing relationships and bringing those voices to the forefront, and not just a transactional, you talk to me so you can give me this type of mentality, but more so to really build trust and rapport with these communities. The more trust, the better the data, and the more you're helping advance an underrepresented group. Third is systems thinking. So I've been iterating this point a lot today, but thinking about how case in point is everything today as we see it, are just everything is connected at some point. Everything we're seeing are multiple systems interacting with one another, linked with one another, affecting and influencing one another. So as you're designing a product, think systemically, how will this product really impact the system, and how will this product impact the culture that lies within the system? Also, as you're going through this evaluation, try to assess how there could be positives coming from this impact, but also maybe some adverse effects on the system, and kind of think with your team about how we might be able to create a socially responsible product. Then finally is diverse recruitment. And this is a pretty tactical piece of advice for researchers. But if you're looking to recruit for your research strategy, try to set a goal for yourself to commit to a diverse and inclusive representation of recruitment. While this might break the norm of representative sampling, you don't want to have higher than a certain N count. Essentially, oversampling to hear from underrepresented and marginalized groups is where we need to go. Just as if we're focusing on the worst off, we can bring everybody up so we can create a better experience. That's what we like to build into doing the literal research of finding those voices and making sure we're having them represented in the insights and in our product cycle. So within our next couple last slides, I'll leave you with this quote. In 2014, Larry Page said to the company, "Focus on the user and all else will follow." Well, in 2020, especially on the equity engineering team, we 1,000% agree with this, but we would also make a couple changes, or at least I would make a few changes, to focus on the underrepresented user first, and all else will follow. And I do believe within that, that is kind of the representation of the curb cut theory, where if we help the worst off, we can bring everybody up with us. And in conclusion, no matter where you come from or what you do, always take calculated risks, advocate for yourself, find empathy and appreciation for others, and truly bet on yourself. Because without these internalized learnings and lessons that I have from my upbringing with advocacy and empathy in striving to craft my own role at Google, I wouldn't be able to do the amazing work that my team is focused on now. So yes, thank you so much for your time. If you're interested in continuing the conversation around equity-centered research or just learning more about my journey or mentorship reasons or connection reasons, please reach out to me. My email is here, as I mentioned earlier, mramsey@google.com, and I will definitely get back to you. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I hope you have a great day.